The one thing that can ruin even the most romantic evening or productive business meeting is conflict. It happens all the time, even to the most committed spouses and longtime business partners. Long, festering disagreements can break up a marriage and a company, but they don't have to. Dana Casperson is a conflict mediator and coach and an expert in conflict resolution. She's also author of the book Changing the Conversation: The 17 Principles of Conflict Resolution. She says conflict is the same across the board, no matter if it happens in the bedroom or the boardroom.
Conflict can be a place of possibility because it can be a place where we find out what matters to people. Depending on how we approach it, we can bring important topics to light. We can find ways to create a ground on which we can talk about them together and then come to these solutions that make sense because they have to do with what people care about on a more basic level. So in all of those conflicts, in personal, work, community, nation, essentially what happens is that people's strategies come into conflict, but underneath that are underlying needs and interests that essentially could be met in a lot of different ways.
Learning productive ways to resolve conflicts is beneficial, though it can be uncomfortable at times. Emotions can run high, and this can be off-putting for individuals who don't like confrontation. Casperson says that if you tell someone in a conflict to quit being hysterical and they stifle their emotions, you lose some valuable information that could help in the resolution.
The emotions themselves are part of the way that we think. They're part of our intelligence. So we need to be able to let them do their work, which is to give us a signal that something else is important to us. We feel angry because we care about this. We feel frightened because this is important to us. And to be able to acknowledge an emotion in a way that doesn't either suppress it or escalate it. So, for example, in the difference between saying, would you just calm down? You know, you're acting like a 3-year-old. Or saying, it sounds like you're furious about this. What's most important to you? So letting emotion help us get to what really matters in the situation.
Dr. Judith Wright agrees. She's an author, corporate consultant, and founder of the Wright Graduate University for the Realization of Human Potential, where she also teaches. She says that in an intimate relationship, it's okay to be emotional and get things off your chest. But be careful of how you say things.
Emotions are part of fighting. So your anger, your fear, your hurt, your sadness, your joy, all those feelings need to be shared, and fighting is one of the ways those things come out. So having your emotions as part of it is important. But also, one of the things that can be really destructive isn't so much what you say. If you say it with contempt or disgust or disdain, that real dismissing way, that's one of the things that can be pretty dangerous in a relationship. That can cause a lot of damage or scar tissue in the relationship. So it's more about, I'm hurt by this, I'm angry about that, and having some venom isn't so terrible if you can really keep somewhat responsible, and if you're not, clean it up pretty quickly.
Wright adds that stewing about a problem and holding it in will only make things worse.
You can get a little distant sometimes, and maybe you can say it a little bit more responsibly, but we have to express ourselves. That not expressing, not fighting, not talking creates a lot of distance, and oftentimes we get resentments that build up. There's a coldness, there's a distance. I mean, maybe a couple's not fighting, but it could be that they're giving each other the silent treatment, which is just as damaging as being able to say things out loud with some emotional tone to it.
Listening carefully to the other person is also crucial. Casperson says that interrupting them to get your own point across shifts the focus of the meeting onto you and makes them feel like you don't care about their opinion.
And one thing that is most important to people in conflict is to know that they've been heard, that you're listening to them and that you're hearing what they care about, whether or not you agree with it. And the other thing is that in conflict, people are often expressing themselves in ways that make it very difficult to hear them, to hear what's important to them. So one of the basic practices of this book is to get used to asking ourselves the question, what would this sound like if it was said without attack? So translating what people are saying, temporarily ignoring the attack, and really focusing our attention in what they care about, what the important information is that's going to help us move towards solution.
Often at work and at home, an individual who's upset with a situation will bend the ears of coworkers and friends. Casperson says this strategy is unproductive and doesn't get to the root of the problem or its resolution.
Figure out what the real problem is, and as opposed to ranting about it to other people or approaching it in a passive-aggressive way or complaining about that person to others, that you go to the person, you bring up the real issue at hand, and have the direct conversation that's going to have the most effect. Because a lot of times conflicts become more escalated when we drag other people into them that actually are not involved in the conflict itself.
Wright says that in her own life, she has discussed conflicts with others, but not to complain to them or to try to get them on her side.
Oftentimes you're just trying to get somebody to back you up, and it can cause this kind of drama triangle where you feel ganged up on or whatever. At the same time, sometimes if you can get another person that has some perspective to help you both see things, that can be helpful, which is why counseling or coaching can be helpful.
Both Casperson and Wright say that sometimes it's best to take a time out, but that doesn't mean walking away from the problem altogether.
Certainly there's times when it's not a great moment to try to talk about it if someone is too upset. And how we approach that can either make it worse or better. So if we say, I'm not going to talk to you about this because you're just going to freak out again, then that's likely to escalate them. It casts them as being incapable of dialogue. But if instead we would say, okay, it looks like you're pretty upset about this. I'm having a hard time talking about this right now. Can we make an arrangement to talk about this in a couple hours? Something like that. So we acknowledge the emotion. We acknowledge the person as capable of doing it at some point and ask, would this be better if we talked about this later?
I had to do this in our relationship with my husband. He was much more verbal than I, and he would ask me a lot of questions, and it felt like it was just coming at me, and I would get kind of frozen and freeze and feel like, defensive, and we had a range signal, like, okay, it's time for a timeout. I would take a timeout, and what that did, it helped me understand, wait a minute, what's going on with me? Why am I so upset about this? What's triggering for me? What's at the heart of this? And if I could get to that heart of the fight and get to my deeper yearning and what this symbolized for me, then I can go back and share more vulnerably with him. Those were some of our most productive fights because they were more honest, they were more true about what was really going on. And that timeout wasn't just to punish my husband or push him away. It was for me to get clear on what I was really feeling and what was going on so I could share more truthfully and vulnerably with him.
Speaking of honesty, Wright says that truthfulness is one of the most important elements for both sides to maintain in a conflict.
Express and agree with the truth always. Tell the truth. If you're in a conflict and your partner or someone says something that's true, even if it bugs you, admit it. So, yep, good point. You're right. Or even begrudgingly give them the point. You know, you're right, and I don't want to give you that satisfaction, but I have to admit that that's true, what you just said. Getting to the truth can really start to unlock things. We're also hungry to be affirmed in a fight, and if somebody keeps denying the reality of it, it's kind of crazy-making.
Since conflict is a normal part of life, is it a good idea to create a time and place to regularly get things out in the open, to discuss what's bugging you? Wright says it's a great idea for confronting those nagging problems head on.
On the couples that we coach, they all do weekly dates, and sometimes that's a dinner and a movie, but oftentimes they also have a weekly meeting. Sometimes it's part of the date, sometimes it's Saturday breakfast, however they decide. But they go through several things, like, okay, what worked for me this week, and what did I love about how you were with me, and what didn't I like, and what's bugging me? And they clear the air, and they also then make a plan for the next week of how they want to be together, what they're afraid of the next week in their work or their career, their family, and what they can help each other with. And they use these as empowering kinds of dates together.
Casperson addresses this strategy at the end of her book and thinks it's a great idea for couples who plan a regular date around it.
Expect and plan for future conflict, which is such a useful event. And it sounds like that's what they've done, which is fantastic. They said we're likely to have ongoing things, little or big. Let's meet every week and just make sure we get it out of the way. So they've already undercut the possibility of festering conflict, and they've found a way to bring it into the open, to talk about it continually, which is great.
What if a conflict isn't resolved to your satisfaction? Do you ever just give in? Casperson says that if a conflict is not resolved to your satisfaction or at all, let it go for a while.
It depends how important it is to you. So if it's something that you really care about and the solution that has been reached is not an effective one, then I would go back and say, okay, we talked about this, and I'm finding that the solution we came up with doesn't really work for me, and here's the reasons. This is what I care about. This is how the solution works in relationship to that. Would you be willing to talk again about if we can find a better way to deal with this situation?
You can read up on Dr. Judith Wright and her work on her website, judithwright.com. For a workbook on how to resolve conflicts productively at home or at work, Pick up Dana Casperson's book, Changing the Conversation, in stores and online. For more information about all of our guests, log on to our site at viewpointsradio.org. This segment originally aired in February 2015 and was written and produced by Pat Reuter. I'm Gary Price.
2 nationwide surveys find that discrimination is a significant barrier to care for people with Alzheimer's and dementia. Half or more of non-white Alzheimer's caregivers report they face discrimination in navigating health care for their recipient. Dr. Carl V. Hill is Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer of the Alzheimer's Association.
The data suggests we have a long way to go to address lack of health equity in healthcare. More than 80% of non-white racial and ethnic groups say it's important for Alzheimer's care providers to understand their backgrounds and experiences. But fewer than half of Blacks and only about 60% of Hispanics and Asian Americans feel confident about their access to culturally competent providers.
The surveys also reveal a lack of trust among Blacks in research clinical trials, and half doubt that advances in Alzheimer's treatments would be shared. These findings are part of the 2021 Alzheimer's Association Facts and Figures Report. Find out more at alz.org/facts.
Welcome to today's Book Minute, brought to you by booktrib.com, the leading source of book news and reviews. Sometimes in life you're given very tough circumstances, every possible hardship or reversal of fortune imaginable. And in that moment, there are 2 roads ahead of you. The road of victimization and failure, yielding to circumstance, or the road of optimism and innovation and recreation of yourself. On the Road Less Traveled, an unlikely journey from the orphanage to the boardroom, is the riveting memoir of Ed Hagem, who faced those 2 roads at a very early age and could have chosen the wrong one. His father literally kidnapped him at age 3 and told him his mother was dead. He grew up in orphanages and foster homes, but he turned his life around, living the American dream as an accomplished Wall Street executive and an inspiration to many. An improbable story filled with human drama, wisdom, and timeless life lessons. On the Road Less Traveled is available at bookstores everywhere.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows. And find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.
Coming up on Viewpoints.
The only snowplows were people driving around in pickup trucks with wide tires. That was about it.
Understanding the winter storm in Texas last month and what went wrong. Then,
this constant checking is the real villain if we want to look at productivity, especially in the early 21st century, is because to check this inbox all the time requires you to shift your context.
How many times a day do you pull away from what you're doing to check your email? I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.